In the past lessons, we dealt with the epic beginnings of historical archaeologies, from that of the Greek and Roman world to that of the great pre-classical civilization of the most ancient Mediterranean Orient. Of this magnificent period, in fact, of the past memory was kept with some continuity for the classical age in the literary documents of Greek and Latin authors, and to a more limited extent of the pre-classical period in the text of the Old Testament in the Bible. Yet, even before what we may call the invention of modern archaeology, in the decades around the middle of the 19th century, the question was arriving about the eventual evidence preserved in the ground of the most ancient humankind, whose origin in the Western world was told in the biblical book of Genesis. Yet, the fact that a sacred book, the Bible, told of humankind's origin as a creation, set serious obstacles to the affirmation of a rigorous scientific criteria for the setting of the problem of humankind origin. Two distinguished geologists, the French Georges Cuvier and the British William Buckland, in the first decades of the 19th century, set the premises for a chronology of the most ancient and extinct animal species by means of accurate description and classifications of fossil animal remains, and they also noticed what they considered the apparent association with human remains. Yet both scholars refused to consider this association between human remains and remains of extinct animals as primary, and they believed that they descended from perturbation and irregularities in geological stratigraphy. Cuvier was quite explicit, and I quote, "It is thus logical to think that man appeared on earth only after other mammal species, as Moses' book says," end of the quote, meaning the Genesis of the Old Testament. Still, at the beginning of the 19th century, the prevailing theory was that of catastrophism, which believed that the most ancient animal species had to become extinct for a natural catastrophe, which had to the biblical universal deluge, but some scholars already raised their voices in favor of a new opposite interpretation, namely evolutionism. In fact, in Paris, Jean-Baptiste de Lamarck maintained that if the remains of extinct animals of different nature were found, this should only depend from the fact that animal species had evolved in time, and those of the origins had to be different from those of historical times. The most enlightened scholars of the European world around 1830, like Johann Gottfried Herder and Johann Wolfgang Goethe, believed on the one hand that, I quote, animals were the eldest brother of man, end of the quote, and on the other hand that only geology could provide a sure element about the time of man's first appearance on Earth. So they maintained the idea of a continuity between animal and human world, basic for a scientific understanding of the appearance, evolution, and disappearance of living species on our planet. In those same years in Europe, they finally convinced themselves that as for animal and human remains in geology, typological characteristics could allow a chronological classification. So in rising archaeology, the typological characteristic of artifacts could be the base for a chronological placement also of every kind of tools made by the human hands. A Danish scholar, Christian Jürgensen Thomsen, had a basic role in this fundamental methodological conquest in the first decade of the 19th century. He had four great merits. First, he understood that in historical development, stone, bronze, and iron were used by men in chronological succession. And second, he thought his discovery was so important that in 1819 he organized a museum based on the historical succession of stone, bronze, iron. Third, he maintained that in order to understand man's artifact, technology was no less important than typology, and also the comparison between archaeological remains and the tools studies by ethnology was a basic one. And finally, fourth point, having ascertained that in some period bronze was used together with iron, he guessed that the study of the unitary complexes of archaeological context was basic for archaeology itself. The theory of the three ages was the base for the formulation of a first overall interpretation of the prehistoric of Denmark, published by Thomson as a manual of Nordic antiquities, and it still remains in contemporary archaeology, nearly 2 centuries later, as the terminological and conceptual base of humankind's development interpreted in the light of technology in every area of our planet. Thomson's work was developed by his pupil, Jens Jacob Worse, who extended the method of it to a large part of Northern Europe, providing its universal soundness, and who, spreading his predecessor's method, engaged himself in making the museum a place of widespread divulgation of scientific discoveries. Another great merit of this scholar was the fact that he closely cooperated with zoologists and geologists. This practice in the study of the most ancient humankind is another basic element of modern archaeology, the meeting and cooperation between two cultures, the sciences of nature and the science of humankind. With the Danish scholars, a great result was achieved for the first time in the history of what we may call the invention of archaeology, which could not be imagined only a few decades before, and which would have been important in consequences in the history of archaeology of the last decades of the 20th century. Their researches proved that working tools were found, which allowed to solve problems in the interpretation of humankind's history without resorting to written sources. The most ancient humankind history could be written using at the same time natural science and human science, and so to say, in a somewhat paradoxical way, it became possible to write the history of prehistory, namely humankind history, before the invention of writing. In conclusion, we may maintain that the birth of a scientific archaeology in the modern world was accomplished when the basic meeting between typology, technology, and stratigraphy was joined by the experiences and discoveries of natural science and ethnological researches. The bases were set for a scientific archaeology aiming at a recovery of historical data, which might allow to reconstruct what in Europe was always perceived as the two main roots of modern world: the Judaic-Christian world within the picture of the ancient Oriental civilizations from Egypt to Mesopotamia to Persia, and the Greek-Roman world within the picture of less advanced peripheral culture from the Celts to the Germans and the Parthians. Still, by the first half of the 20th century, great, very much open-minded archaeologists like the prehistorian Gordon Childe, who called the ancient Near Eastern civilization as a whole the most ancient East, or the Egyptologist Henry Breasted, who invented for those civilizations the term Fertile Crescent, considered the culture of pre-Columbian America something bizarre and irrelevant. They had no interest for American archaeology because it was, and I quote, outside the mainstream of history, end of a quote, according in fact to Gordon Childe himself words. Really, the first pioneer expedition at the discovery of some at least of the pre-Columbian civilization of Central America took place in the same years as the first important archaeological expedition, which gave birth to the classical archaeology and to Near Eastern archaeology. These are the expedition to Chiapas and Yucatan in 1841 and 1842, made by an American traveler and archaeologist John Lloyd Stephens. This brilliant writer, which traveled also to Europe, always attracted by the archaeological sites, drew attention upon some of the most spectacular fields of ruins of the ancient centers of Maya civilization, often almost completely covered by the luxuriant tropical vegetation. He asked the question whether those were abandoned cities of a historic period, like in Indochina, or rather remains of a forgotten civilization as in Egypt. Yet the beginning of a true archaeology of Central America took place at the end of the 19th century, with the British Sir Alfred Maudslay expeditions. In 15 years of researches in the impenetrable forest of southern Mexico, Honduras, and Guatemala, which ended in 1902, he visited, described, and made the world know extraordinary monuments of several most important centuries like Copan, Quiricuán, Chichen Itza, and Palenque, which are among the most important archaeological sites of the classical and post-classical Maya period. After the beginning, the study of civilization and cultures of pre-Columbia America knew an ever-growing development which progressively demonstrated that many paradigms used for the study of prehistory in Europe and of the great civilization of the Mediterranean were not suitable for the different realities of the economic and social structures of the most ancient world of Americas, and even in the paradigm of the three ages was not at all convenient for the cultural development of the pre-Columbia America. The very complicated problem of the genealogical relations between the early villages communities, defined as an American Neolithic, quite certainly originated in the Valley of Mexico, and the great historical civilization of Peru and Mexico, Inca and Maya, dominated the debate for a long time, because there is no doubt that there are strong elements of continuity in cultural context, which, however, feature very strong characteristic of specificity. This is not the place to recall the very numerous archaeological expeditions in the Americas, yet we wish to recall that an effective outline of the history of the development of the New World archaeology was made by Gordon Willey, who singled out four main phases characterized by peculiar trends. The most ancient phase was called by Willey speculative period. It was a pioneer or preparatory era which, since the Europeans' arrival to the New World, reached to the middle of the 19th century, the years of the first travels to the discovery of the first important archaeological sites. The second period, called the descriptive period, was the age of the first great discoveries, characterized between the mid-19th century and the early 20th century by the basic systematic description of the recovered sites. The third period is the descriptive historical period, stretching to the mid-20th century, when the stratigraphic method was applied to the archaeological sites of America and problems of chronology in the individual studies area were dealt with by means of scientific criteria. And finally, the comparative historical period, stretching to the time of the revolutionary settings of new archaeology around the 70s of the past century, being main certainties about absolute chronology achieved, was the age in which the foundations were set for a widespread inter-regional comparison. Turning our attention from the Americas to Asia, and in particular to India and China, we immediately notice in which huge way the archaeology of prehistory of Europe and of the great Mediterranean civilizations of the second half of the 20th century understandably lost completely its centrality, mainly based on the fact that what we call the invention of archaeology was a result of the way the European world used in order to look at the past. We have the same feeling when we turning to Africa for the primary role of African continent nowadays, as in the researches about the most ancient evidences of Homo sapiens on our planet. As regards the antiquities of India, very little was known of them until 1923, when Daya Ram Sahni started to excavate Harappa, nearly 480 kilometers northwest of Delhi, and about the same time, Banerjee began to explore Mohenjo-Daro, nearly 650 kilometers south of Harappa. Particularly Mortimer Wheeler's and Stuart Pigot's studies between 1939 and 1945 allowed for the first time to set in a clear historical light that the very ancient urban civilization revealed by the two main centers, which flourished for nearly 1 millennium in the years around 2500 BC over a very large territory in the Indus Valley. In the same years as the first excavation of Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro, a Swedish geologist, Gunnar Andersson, acting as advisor to the Chinese government, discovered the first evidences of Paleolithic and Neolithic cultures in the Yellow River Valley at Horan, Shensi, and Shanxi. Since then, huge progress was achieved in India and China as regards the reconstruction of the phases of prehistory and history of those very ancient civilizations characterized by an impressive continuity with very intense activities, which also led to the discovery of very strong impact like the discovery in 1974 of some sector of the tomb of Qin Shi Huang, first emperor of China, buried with his huge army of clay warriors dating from the end of the 3rd century BC. As we have seen, the progress in the archaeology of these great countries are undoubtedly exceptional for the extent and capillarity of the research over the territory. Yet the Western world observes them with attention and amazement because these countries, though adopting and re-elaborating techniques and procedures invented by the European and American archaeology, are developing methodologies and interpretations rooted in their tradition, and which will be a spur for the formulation of method innovation also in the Western world.